In this review, we'll be taking a look at Barotrauma. I'll be covering the single-player experience from a new player's perspective, and at the end of the video I'll make a recommendation as to whether it is currently worth buying at full price or on a sale, and what you need to consider before getting into the game. I'll start by saying that it's definitely an acquired taste, but a pretty good one once you get accustomed to it. When I initially picked up the game, I was put off by a few things that caused me to stop playing the game after having spent very little time with it, which I'll talk about in more detail later in the video. However, after a few people recommended the game to me, I decided to revisit it again. I spent some more time playing it, and after sticking with it for a while, I reached a point where things really started to click. Since then, I found that every hour spent with the game has been getting better and better. There's a lot to like about the game, and if you haven't played it in a while, the latest update makes revisiting the game worth it because they have added plenty of quality of life improvements. They've also included updates to make the game more accessible for new players, and while these systems are by no means perfect, it's a big step up from what it used to be. This is a management game based heavily around systems and emergent gameplay. You can draw comparisons between this and a lot of the other games that I've covered on my channel, including Astronauts, Tin Can, Objects in Space, Duskers, Delta V, and Naughty Crawl. The closest alternative is probably Astronauts, but it should be said that Barotrauma is very far along for an early access game, and there's already the potential for players to sink dozens of hours into the game. It also scratches that same itch of interacting with the world through interfaces and tools, similar to Duskers, but of course your player is also represented in the world, so there's every chance that a blip on the sonar could be a sea monster that may end up standing right next to you at some point. It's these moments where Barotrauma really comes alive, and it's one of these moments where the game really started to click for me. I'll tell you a short story about one of these experiences that I had in the game. During one of my missions, I noticed a number of blips appearing on the sonar quickly closing in on my sub, and within moments we were attacked by enemies from all sides. I was completely unprepared for the attack and only had one member of the crew manning one of the sub's external guns. As a result, we were quickly overwhelmed and the enemies had breached the sub in multiple places. Water was flooding in as I was frantically running to get a diving suit and some weapons, and over the next few minutes a game of cat and mouse unfolded where my two crewmates died as we were trying to fight off the hostiles. Eventually I managed to kill all the enemies, but the sub was falling apart around me. I then set about welding up all the breaches in the hull and started fixing up the critical systems to drain the water and get oxygen back online in the sub. After giving my character the necessary medical care and continuing my efforts to patch up the ship, I couldn't believe that I somehow managed to survive the attack. At this point I was getting really hopeful about making my way back to an outpost. My optimism unfortunately was short-lived because as I finished patching up the remaining systems in the ship, I noticed that we had run out of fuel cores for the reactor. Without it, I wouldn't be able to make my way back to an outpost, so I would die there, but I was completely hooked on Barotrauma. This is what I love about the game, the same thing that I love about all games like this. The emergent gameplay leads to interesting stories that are unique to you as the player. The steep difficulty makes success feel earned, but it's the experience of failure where the game really shines. The complexity of multiple systems and tools in the game means that there's also multiple ways to solve problems. This means that Barotrauma pulls off something that very few games manage to achieve. It makes failure feel fun and interesting. Every time I've spectacularly failed in Barotrauma, I've massively enjoyed the experience, and as the sub was sinking to the bottom of the ocean, I was already thinking about what I'll be doing differently next time. So it should be pretty clear at this point that I would recommend this game, but as always, I'll keep things balanced by talking about aspects of the game that I enjoyed less, or that you may just want to be aware of before getting into it. Barotrauma has improved a lot in terms of onboarding new players through tutorials, pop-up hints and tooltips, but that said, keep in mind that the game still is in early access and the initial learning curve is quite steep. Be prepared to start over a few times and spend the first few hours working out how everything in the game works. It is worth it and you'll be rewarded for sticking with it. Just be aware that some of the mechanics in the game aren't the most intuitive, at least when you're starting out. Related to this, note that while Barotrauma can stand on its own as a single-player game, there are some areas where it still feels like the game should be balanced in terms of the single-player experience. Most notably, the crew feels pretty useless when you're venturing outside the submarine. This is where playing alongside real people will bring a huge advantage because the current AI implementation doesn't really meet the requirement here. On the plus side, I do find that orders inside the sub work really well, and if you do the correct assignments and prioritizations for each crew member, you can be very effective when dealing with situations like attacks, leaks, maintenance, etc. The single player can also do with a feature to speed up the in-game time. The pacing is fine for the most part, but eventually you will get into situations where you're just slowly crawling your way towards the next outpost with nothing interesting to do. This is fine at first, but it becomes more and more tedious the more you play the game. My next point will definitely be controversial, because when it comes to things like art and animation, everyone will have their own preference. So with that qualifier out of the way, I'll state that I'm not a fan of the paper doll art style and the janky animations in the game. My biggest problem is that the game seems to have two different identities that don't really complement each other. On the one hand, it takes a fairly serious tone in terms of the sound design, punishing mechanics, the horror elements, and the muted color palette used in the art style. On the other hand, you have this paper doll art with the janky physics that is quite comical with ridiculous running and climbing animations. I understand why they did it. The game is designed to be played multiplayer, and the janky physics makes for funnier YouTube videos when people are uploading their multiplayer gameplay footage. And ultimately that means more views on YouTube and more sales for the game. So from a commercial perspective, it may have been the right decision. It's difficult to say for sure. Personally though, I would have preferred the character models and animations to fit the tone of the rest of the game, because as it stands, it really breaks the immersion and can pull you out of the experience at times. I want to make it clear that even though the store page mentions that this is a horror game, it really does not feel that way, at least to me. I'm going to draw some comparisons to a couple of other games to explain what I mean here. I always thought that Subnautica was a masterclass in how to balance different emotions in a game. At times it's incredibly peaceful and relaxing, and at other times it can be terrifying. Subnautica's best quality is how immersive it feels, and while there is some fantastic humor in Subnautica, it is subtle enough that it never breaks the immersion of the game. On the other end of the spectrum, you have games like Breath Edge, which beats the player over the head with relentless slapstick humor that not only ruins the immersion, but basically ruins the entire game. So in terms of their approach to humor, Barotrauma sits in the middle of a spectrum, where Subnautica is a masterclass in how to include subtle humor in a game while keeping it serious and immersive, versus Breath Edge, which is a masterclass in how you shouldn't do it. To be fair to Barotrauma, it is probably a lot closer to Subnautica than it is Breath Edge, but I think it could have been even better if it took a more subtle approach to humor. In fact, while we are comparing games, I think Duskers is perhaps a better comparison, because Duskers illustrates that even indie games with very limited graphics can be very immersive with the right tone and sound design. And as a result, I found Duskers to be a lot more enjoyable compared to something like Barotrauma. Of course, that's not to say that Barotrauma isn't enjoyable. It is a good game, but there still is a lot of room for improvement. So, should you pick this one up at full price? Well, I think it may be worth the full price, but probably only if you really enjoy similar games. For most other people, I'd probably recommend waiting for a sale. Even if you could just get 20 or 30% off the full price on Steam, it's probably going to be worth it for you at that price point. Most importantly, do wait until you have a lot of time at your disposal to learn the game's systems, because, as I said, it will take some time to get into it. If you've already played Barotrauma and you enjoyed it, you should definitely check out some of the other games on my channel. And as always, if you'd like to see more, please like and subscribe, as I'll be covering more games like Barotrauma, and I also cover a lot of other great indie games, so I'd love to see you for those videos as well.